What's up, guys? Today I'm going to be talking to you about out of stocks because I handle them a little bit differently now, and I'm also going to give you an overview of everything that I know about out of stocks and what led me to handle them the way that I do now. That being said, let's focus on this prompt. This is what I refer to as the order replacement prompt, and it can be used as a pretty generic catch-all for a bunch of different problems that include out of stocks or repricing problems or issues in the listing related to the advertised quantity of the listing. For example, when you have a 12 count advertised, but you realize that Walmart's actually going to ship out a 6 count or something like that, right? So there's a couple different points here. You don't have to use this exact wordage. You can. It doesn't really matter. But if you understand the 4 main parts of this prompt, because they each have a specific purpose, then you're going to be able to make your kind of better decisions in your own customer service in your own business, right? So first, before I get into what each of these kind of different colors mean and what they represent, it's really important that you understand that when it comes to customer service and messaging, you have to use as few words as you possibly can. Most templates out there are way too flowery. They have whole paragraphs of shit. Like, people nowadays don't want to read the stuff that they're actually interested in, let alone read whole paragraphs from people about problems related to something that they bought. You don't want that to be what's happening to the buyer. You want the wording to be very clear and minimal, as few sentences as possible, because this leads to the least misunderstandings. And almost all negative experiences with a buyer are rooted in the misconception the buyer has about you as a seller. You have to assume that all of your buyers are going to expect that you are trying to fuck them over. As soon as something gets wrong, it's very important that as a seller, you assume your buyer is going to think that you did it on purpose. So you have to communicate with them and make it obvious that that is not the case, okay? And so that gets into the wording that we're using here. You don't have to use the same wording, but it is important that you have some other sentence, not a paragraph, that accomplishes the same purpose, right? So imagine you have an out-of-stock scenario. And honestly, if you can learn to not stress out about out-of-stocks, the chance of you working out as a dropshipper is just up huge. Like, out-of-stocks are the bane of dropshippers' existence. They're the reason that dropshipping is viewed as sketchy. Like, if out-of-stocks weren't a problem, then like drop shipping would be a very different experience, right? Like, it really genuinely would be, because you wouldn't have to twist the scenario to keep your eBay account. Whereas if you handle an out of stock by saying, hey, I'm out of stock, and you cancel it appropriately, you can lose your eBay account really, really quickly that way. So you have to make sure that that doesn't happen, right? So first, you need to communicate with the buyer and address that there is a problem, okay? Because that's step 1. Now, again, understand that the buyer is going to think that you're telling them it's their fault unless you specifically say that it is your fault. Like, take responsibility for the mistake, right? That's why I almost always use the sentence, I take full responsibility for this mistake, just to make it clear that it's not the buyer's fault. Okay? And again, if you have whole paragraphs, what happens is that each sentence becomes less valuable. What you're going to find is that maybe you started out saying, I take full responsibility for this mistake, but by the end of the paragraph and you bringing up children and sickness and warehouses and shit, like, you've lost the buyer. It's just pointless. So make sure that you use minimal wording. It's important. And it's going to help expedite the process, okay? Again, the most important thing is that you communicate with the buyers and communicate quickly. That's another big thing with out of stocks. If you respond to the scenario within 12 or even 24 hours, that's you're probably going to be okay. The buyer is much more likely to be understanding. But if you let 3, 4, or 5 days pass before you communicate with the buyer at all, That makes sense that they would be frustrated. Think about it from their side. They've ordered something and they're excited, and 3 or 4 days have passed, and in their head they're like, oh, well, it's definitely shipped. It's about to ship. I'm just waiting for the tracking number. Maybe it's going to show up. They're checking their door to see if it's there, but it's not. But maybe, I don't know, maybe this is one of those eBay sellers who doesn't upload their tracking numbers. They're hopeful, and then you tell them that you didn't even send the item out. It's ridiculous. Make sure you don't do that. Communicate quickly, okay? And then the next thing that we're getting into here is how eBay feels when they look at this message, because that's super important. You have to also understand that everything that you have on eBay is omniscient about its messaging. If you've sent it or received it, it knows, okay? So there are going to be times where there are eBay representatives looking over your messages in a scenario. You want to make sure that there's not any information in the way that you message that directly states that you're out of stock or directly admits it. That's why you want to be a bit general. You don't have to say exactly what went wrong. You just have to say what the options are to fix it and say that you made a mistake, right? And it's really important that eBay feels like you are trying to work with the buyer, okay? So you can accomplish this by offering the buyer something, some kind of incentive, right? So you accomplish this in this scenario by offering any other item in your store at like $10 more than the item that you sold. Because then when eBay looks at this, and from the buyer's perspective, they're like, okay, this person fucks up, but they're willing to take a loss or break even on another item just to make it right. And that's going to be really important both for the buyer and for when eBay looks at these interactions. You want to make sure that you're not saying any unnecessary words that get you in trouble when you could have just not said that sentence in the first place. Less is more, all right? And then ultimately you offer the thing that you really want them to do and that they're going to do most of the time, which is ask for you to cancel the sale or refund it. Most people, when they receive this prompt, they're going to respond and say that they would like a full refund. So then the moment you have that message, it's justifiable for you to be like, okay, I cancel the sale because the buyer asked me to cancel the sale because they did, and the message shows it. You leave the proper trail. So then you're not going to get in trouble with eBay. Okay. That being said, I do think it is important to cancel them properly every now and then. Like if you have a big eBay account, you want to make sure that you don't have a 0% defect rate. Like if you're selling like 50, 100 items a day, how the fuck are you not having a defect problem? Like that doesn't make sense. That doesn't make sense at all, does it? So now you understand this. I'm going to be quiet for a second. Let myself gather my thoughts. This is how I handle out of stocks now. But let's talk about other alternatives and other things that I tried in the past that led me to handle out of stocks this way. Okay? So one of the things that I originally did was I knew that on eBay, there's 2 defect rates that actually matter. And that is how often you admit that you're out of stock. Like if you cancel the sale because you're out of stock, that can get your account taken down. The other defect is if you let a case get escalated without closing it. Okay? So that means somebody opens an item not received case or return case, or actually a return case wouldn't work. Item not received case or item not described or whatever, and then you do nothing about it, and then 5 days later it gets escalated to eBay. That counts against your account, right? So with out of stocks, at first I was bothered. I was like, I don't want to just say that the buyer canceled. I don't want to just do that. I don't want to be dishonest. I got to figure out an honest solution for this problem. So what I would do is I would just send the wrong item because then they would open a return. And ultimately, a return it's not going to jeopardize your eBay account. As long as you respond to returns, then it's going to be fine, right? And the way that Walmart's return process works, as long as you didn't pay for shipping, you can return something to Walmart for free with the prepaid shipping label and ultimately only lose the PayPal transaction 30 cents because you get everything refunded. And because you didn't pay shipping, you can even admit that you can be honest about the return to Walmart. Like you can say, I just don't want it anymore. And normally they would charge you the return, or they wouldn't refund you the original shipping cost. But as long as it was a free shipping eligible item, there is no shipping cost to refund. So you can effectively say that you have a return and be honest about why you're returning it and get the full refund for the buyer and all that kind of stuff, right? So that's one way that you can kind of twist it. Because what you need to do is the out of stock scenario comes up, and depending on how many of them you got, you have to kind of lessen the blow to your account by twisting the out of stocks into different scenarios, right? So there are going to be times where you get like 20 orders and they're all out of stock. Like there's pricing wrong for something, and it happens to be a really hot in-demand item, and it happens to get the right attention, and you log into your account to do the work for the day, and in the 12 hours since you last checked, there's been 36 sales of one item that isn't available, right? Stuff like that happens. I've had that event happen 3 separate occasions with between 15 and 25 orders. And this is where most bad feedback comes from. It comes from these unique circumstances that led to a whole bunch of out of stocks on your account, which then makes the ding that it takes a while to get rid of, right? And it's really important when you're dealing with out of stocks in like a form like that, you really want to like separate the blow, right? So what I would do in that scenario is for most of the out of stock listings, I would send this prompt. But for some of the out of stock listings, I would purposefully send the wrong item, right? And then for others, I might be more experimental, okay? And so that wasn't one thing that I would do. I would send the wrong item. And that worked. It successfully mitigates the chance of you losing your eBay account. However, it stresses your source account, because one of the ways that your source accounts are commonly lost is that the retailer feels that you return things too often compared to the amount of business that you're bringing in. So that can lead them to terminate your account, right? That's something that you need to be wary of. And so I kind of stopped doing it for that reason, because I was like, all right, I can probably find a solution that doesn't stress out my source accounts, right? So after that, I went through a phase of like, okay, well, if they open an item not received case, and then I close that case with a full refund, it's like nothing happened, and it doesn't hurt my account, right? So that's one thing I started doing, was just doing literally nothing and seeing what happened, right? And that kind of worked, because it did mitigate the damage, because you don't get in trouble for that, because the item not received case gets opened, and then you issue a full refund and it gets closed in your favor, right? However, this isn't good for the buyers, because they have no idea what's going on, right? So then I went and I improved it one iteration, and I would send a message and be like, hey there, unfortunately, I am unable to determine when I'm going to be able to ship this item out. It's currently on back order. And that was my version of this prompt that you see right now. That's what kind of led to this, because the hope was that the buyer would ask for a full refund, not wait, right? Although if they waited, then eventually it would work. And sometimes that did happen, like that. It did work out that way. But ultimately, it's not good to talk about delays and not knowing when you're going to send it. And it was definitely like staying in communication with buyers isn't something that I advise. Like, you want to make sure that the next step is stated and given, and then that's it. Like, you don't want back and forth. Back and forth is really time consuming, and that's not ideal at all. So that was something I did, was try and get people to open item not received cases. And that worked out in the sense that, like, yeah, it successfully avoids the out of stocks, but it affects your feedback rate, because people don't want, They don't want, they're not super happy about that. And that's what's kind of interesting about out of stocks is depending on how you flip it, it either like hurts your source account or hurts your feedback more. It stresses something, a certain joint in your business out more, proportionately more than everything else, right? So that's why I go with what we have here now, is that I went through all these different experiments and trying things, and ultimately I found that this is the thing that it covers you if an eBay rep looks at it, because they really like this part that you're offering, you're working with the buyer, you're providing good customer service in their opinion. Also, it covers that you acknowledge that there's something wrong and that you take responsibility for the mistake. You say it's my fault, not the buyer's fault, right? And then it shows that you can issue them. You're giving the buyer a choice. Choices are good because then they feel like they're more in control. So also, depending on how you use prompts like this, I usually, like, almost all of the messages that I send out nowadays are related to this somehow. It's if there's some kind of problem, and then I use like catch-all phrasing, because then it's easy for VAs to do it because it's the same prompt for like 20 different scenarios instead of like different scenarios for every prompt, right? So an example of how you might want to change this is like, imagine that you sold an item, but it's available in blue and your listing says that it's in red. Well, you could actually change the generic wording here. And instead of saying I am unable to ship out this particular item as advertised, you can say something like, I have this item in red, not blue. Okay? So here you're communicating what's wrong, and then also that means that you can give them a third option. Okay? So that would look something like this. I could also send you the red one instead of the blue one that you were expecting, if you would like. And then we're giving them 3 options, and that's good. The more options you give the buyer, eBay's going to like that, and the buyer's going to like that, and it's just good in general. You just got to figure out, like, okay, is this an actual option that the buyer feels like is a decision they can make, or is this just the vibe that I'm bullcrapping them? Because, you know, like, if I just make up a whole bunch of crap here about warehouses and sick children and that kind of thing, and then I'm like, or I could give you a full refund, it's like, all right. I mean, like, people are gonna deal with that because, like, on the off chance that you're telling the truth, but a big part of them is gonna be like, heh, who's this? What's up with this guy? Who's this guy fooling? All right, guys. I hope this has helped you handle out of stocks. Again, it's really not a huge problem. And what you should do is you should look at the time that you spend to process an out of stock sale versus an in stock sale, because ultimately it's a similar amount of time that should be spent for each. When you get a sale, you identify if it's in stock. You identify if it's profitable. You source it or you order it. Okay? If it's out of stock, you identify that it's out of stock. Then you send the buyer replacement prompt. Then you move on to the next item, because you don't do anything until the buyer responds to you. Okay? And so that's another thing. You are going to have times where the buyer just never responds. And then, like, they eventually open an item not received case, or they eventually do. This doesn't fully mitigate everything, but in my opinion, it lessens the blow the most efficiently. Okay? All right, guys. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Ciao.